Hello, this is Gene Pease. I'm sitting in beautiful Marina del Rey, California, and wherever you are, I want to thank you for spending time with me today. We're going to talk about how to transform your HR reporting into people analytics. I'm having trouble. Let me get started here. There we go. I'm sorry. The takeaways today, there's four that I want to focus on. One is I want you to understand why analytics is so important, and more importantly, how you overcome obstacles to getting started. I'm going to show you a proven business impact framework that identifies not only the data that you need, but how to analyze that data. We're going to understand the basics of how to move from reporting to descriptive analytics, and then the basics around how you move to predictive analytics. And the fourth is we're going to talk a minute at the end around how you communicate to really drive change, which was the point of all of this. I've been at this for a little while. In 2004, I started a company with some scientists from Duke University, and we started applying drug trial methodology to training investments. Eventually, we built a software product called Vectrix, which was one of the first predictive analytics SaaS platforms specifically built for human capital. Along the way, I wrote 3 books, and I was honored that Jack Fitz-Enz was my co-author in my first book. And in 2016, Ultimate Software bought Vectrix to be the core of their predictive analytics platform. I took last year off to really study why so many companies were not applying people analytics in spite of all the evidence that analytics is valuable. And so I developed a training course that we're going to highlight. And this webinar is really the summary of the last 13 years of work and my 3 books. As part of that, we developed over 14 published case studies that you can find both in the books and on my website. And the point of that is to show that you can apply advanced analytics really to almost any investment in the employee life cycle. Some of these were done, I want to give credit to Bellevue University's Human Capital Lab. These are all done with industry brand names, and we really had to use large companies to prove that this work could be done. But I want to tell you that this work I'm going to show you today can be done with a company of any size. So before we get started, let's talk a little bit about what people analytics is. And this is my favorite quote out of all those in the industry about the definition of people analytics. And it's really using data and analytical tools to identify insights that we normally couldn't see and to help us make better and more accurate decisions. I don't really care what you call people analytics. It could be called human capital analytics, etc. It's really the work that's important versus what we call it. We know that companies that build capabilities in analytics outperform their peers. We also know that for every dollar invested, there's a significant payback in this work. So we're beyond the point in the industry of proving this work can be done, and we've seen the value of it with case studies and etc. But the problem still exists is, why is HR so far behind in adopting this work? And that's where this webinar comes in, my books, and hopefully my training course. We just simply have to do better. And you, being virtue of this webinar, is in one of the early adopters of this work. So not only are you going to help impact your career, but you're going to help impact the results within your organization. So I applaud you for taking the time to invest in this. So let's talk about what these words mean and how we look at it from an analytics continuum. Reporting is really what you do every day, every week, every month. It's your activity reporting within your department. We then move into descriptive analytics, which is the preliminary stage of data processing, looking at historical things to find success and failure. Predictive analytics is the next step, and it's really using that prior data, historical data and descriptive analytics, and using it to predict what will happen in the future. And then there's a fourth category called prescriptive that we're not going to spend much time on because, frankly, we've got to move the industry from reporting into descriptive and eventually predictive. It's really the advanced companies in the industry that are using prescriptive. I like to look at it, though, the continuum in a non-linear way, and I built this as a mountain. What the whole idea is the climbing gets harder the further you get, but the view gets better. And so as you move up the continuum, you need more advanced skill sets. And I've intentionally built the difference between descriptive and predictive as a cliff, because you're really moving from correlations to causation. And we'll talk about that and why it's not easy to climb that cliff. But when you do, you see some amazing insights you can't get any other way. So reporting, as I said, is really department activity metrics, mostly used in scorecards. It's typically single metrics and from a single system. Descriptive then is taking multi-metrics, really from multi-systems, and finding trends and comparisons. You could even begin to add benchmarks in this. And it's using typically pivot tables, Excel pivot tables, to find correlations. So you're finding relationships in this different data that you can't find by just strictly doing reporting. And then predictive is adding statistics to the descriptive mix, which gives you moves from correlations to causation. It's multi-metrics like descriptive, it's multi-systems like descriptive, but you're really then moving from demographics into segmentation because you're moving into causation. And many cases we're now beginning to use in the predictive world things like new data sources and techniques like machine learning. And then again, I won't talk about prescriptive here because it's still in the very, very, very early stages. In descriptive analytics, you can answer these kinds of questions. It's really looking at how the investment's beginning to work and where it's beginning to work and where it might not be. And you're finding relationships where you know things are related. You're not sure exactly how, but things are moving in directions that you like, and you're beginning to understand what's behind the investment and where it's working. When you move into predictive, you're then taking that descriptive information and then predicting against it with accuracy. So you can begin to look at things like who's at risk to leave next and what investments enable people to become high performers, for example. So we're going to launch a poll. We'll take a minute, and if I do this right, we'll launch a poll. And we'll see how this audience feels about where you are on the analytics continuum. I'm just trying to start. Departmental reporting, descriptive analysis, predictive, and I'm just not sure. So here we go. We're going to close the poll. And I don't know if you can see the results, but the poll closed. Here we go. Thank you. This is very typical, and I applaud the few of you that are moving into predictive. But for the most part, this is typical of what I see in all of the different speaking and seminars that I do. And that is the vast majority, that would be 60, 70 some percent on this call, on this webinar, are really in departmental reporting and trying to get started. And then there's a few of you, a handful, 26% that are moving into descriptive and then predictive. So this is awesome. This is exactly kind of what the industry is telling us. and why getting started to me, and I hopefully will show you why it's so important. These are the top objections I found over the years on why people don't get started in this work. And hopefully we'll talk about how you overcome these. But for the most part, people talk about, I don't know how to get started, or it's too difficult. Now, outside of HR, and even probably some senior bosses in HR feel they're not sure about the value of the work. So we have to show them, and that's why case studies and all the literature around the work that's being done, we should be able to prove the value of this work. Just about everybody believes our data is bad, and I'll spend a few minutes in a little bit talking about HR data, and it isn't very good, but we've got to begin to work with it. And then there's still the spookiness factor, and with all of the data breaches we've had in the last year, the spookiness factor is going up. And so I'll talk about the ethics and transparency about using this work. And then some people in HR still prefer their gut feelings, and lots of people, because we're trying to do more work with less people, we're too busy to take this on. So you've got to find the objections that are within your organization and really fight to overcome those. And hopefully today's webinar and some other tools we will show you, we'll give you the ammunition to get going. And I love this quote from a friend of mine at VF, Ron Lawrence, and it's, you better get going because the future won't be kind. And he was talking about adopting analytics within the HR function. So how do I get started? So you probably have lots of issues you might want to tackle. So here's one way. This is 4-box. People like 4 boxes, are kind of simple. I've plotted on the left the time. It could be the cost. So the timeline would go up the longer it would take to do an analysis, or the more cost it would take, the longer it would do an analysis. On the lower, we talk about having business impact. So what are my investments doing? And I obviously want to move into the areas that are having business impact. So I might think about, is it a large investment and it may be a large investment, but it would also take a long time to deploy and cost. And so I'd say I probably want to study that in the future, but I'm not so sure I want to put all my resources into that today. What about a long lead time to results? It's an initiative, a leadership development program that's going to take 2 years for their leaders to complete it. I probably don't want to think about tackling that today. There might be some other projects I can find that would have higher business impact without the time factor. I'm in a retail organization, and this year customer facing is our entire focus on our organization. That one looks like it. I have high business impact and relatively low time to do the study. So let's plot it and think about doing that. I've got a whole series of tactical initiatives like compliance training that easy to measure, won't take long, but not tremendously high value. So I probably don't want to put a lot of resources into that. And maybe it's a multi-year investment, and it's a very important investment. And so I can be measuring it as I go, and I can relatively quickly, with high business impact, see how I'm doing and making adjustments. So this is just one way that you can begin to think about how to get started. There may be others. There's lots of other ideas you may have. You may have other criteria. So I'm just trying to, again, give you ideas on how to jumpstart your thinking on this. As you then start prioritizing your questions and your hypothesis, you need to begin to think about the privacy. And this is even more important than it was several years ago as we get better at this work. And we've had things like data breaches. So what approvals do you need to capture this data and do this work? Do you have a sponsor that can help you navigate some of the political issues of capturing data you're going to need that's outside of your area and or outside of HR? Does the organization have any standard operating procedures related to data? Some do and some don't, but in most cases, IT will have some way that they can help you with both the security aspects, encryption, and then are there any legal issues you may have around data? You might be a European company which has different requirements on handling data than we do in the US, for example. And then David Cole, another friend of mine, a CHRO, says find a champion in the business to experiment. And it doesn't necessarily even have to be with deep analytics. I'll talk about some of the work you can do in descriptive analytics, for example, but find a business champion and partner with them. Now, privacy and transparency is becoming a really, really big issue. And it's not surprising that the majority of employees don't think their employers keeping their data private. That's pretty scary, but that's how people feel. And they also don't think, the vast majority don't think they're telling them the truth on what data they are collecting. And these are difficult issues to deal with. And so we're trying to figure out where you go from gray into black. And so really the ethics of this use is really how you've got to begin to think about it. What is going to be the use of the findings? Are you going to use it for good, to try to help improve people's productivity, their tenure, their engagement, or you're going to try to root out bad behavior and use it for bad? What bias do you and your organization have on not only the use of the data, but bias within the data? And what demographics are you going to be allowed to data mine? Can you look at age or not, or gender or background? These are tricky issues, and there's no right or wrong. These are cultural issues within a company. But I can tell you the industry is moving towards transparency because of the lack of trust our employees have of our data. And so I like this quote from David Greenhalgh of IBM. If you can't explain to your employees why you're doing a project, then you shouldn't be doing it. So when is too much too much? When do you go from gray area into the black? And I don't know the answer to that, but you have to begin to think about that. But thinking about it with the use of ethics to kind of protect you will help you in your view of this. So next we're going to roll into what I call our business impact framework. And there's 5 steps to this. So once you have selected a project, once you've selected a problem you want to study, then if you go through these 4 or 5 steps, depending if you move into predictive, you will have a successful framework to develop a project. So we're going to roll through these. First one is the framework 1, which is analysis design. This is where you're meeting with your stakeholders, you're identifying the problems, and you're creating the hypothesis. And then once you do that, I'm going to show you how you design a measurement map, which is be a visual depiction of the investment and a visual depiction of the study. When you get started, and I assume most of you on this webinar would fall in this category, you need a business analyst. I don't really care what you call it. We called ours at Vectrix, we called them human capital strategists. But whatever you call this person, you need them to become really your quarterback for these studies. They organize the work, they collaborate with stakeholders, they manage the workload, they interpret and present the findings, and hopefully they push for change. And so we need an analyst to begin to apply this framework once we've decided to get going. Now, many companies I've run across always think about their data, and they think about what questions I may have around their data. And I contend, and most of the thought leaders in the industry agree with me, that you should not think about your data. You should focus your efforts at the very beginning around questions. And then once you've identified those questions, prioritize those that potentially deliver the most value. So do not take a data-first approach, please, because you're going to limit your thinking and limit your possibilities of problems you may be able to solve. Then Ian O'Keefe at JP Morgan gave me this quote on how you define a question and really get started. And it really has three components that I think are perfect. Make sure the question is strategy aligned. It creates quantifiable value, and it can be acted upon. So these are not studies that we're doing at a university for a book. We're doing studies to help improve our organization and the people within it. You should be looking at with two lenses. One, from the organization's point of view. What are their performance? What are the goals that we're trying to achieve? And you want to be looking at it from the individual's point of view. How can I improve retention, engagement, and help advance their careers? Now, when you do this, though, one of the challenges we have is the vocabulary of KPI, key performance indicator. Now, originally KPIs came from dashboards where you could see how fast you were traveling at a glance, how much oil or how much gas was left on your trip. But unfortunately, KPIs have evolved into, here's over a dozen different categories of indicators. And what I found over the years is that people spend a tremendous amount of time talking about and arguing over what KPIs are pertinent. And sometimes they come up with 30 or 40 or 50, and they never can agree on what a KPI is for their business versus getting started. And so when we developed over the years this framework, we got rid of the word KPI in our vocabulary, in our clients' vocabulary, and we replaced that with leading indicator and business result. So a leading indicator is evidence of things to come. They're typically things you cannot put in a financial value on. And a business result, exactly what it sounds like. It carries a financial value, and you can put a dollar value on that. So when you develop your hypothesis and you're trying to build your chain of evidence, instead of thinking about KPIs, we use the vocabulary leading indicators and business results. And I can promise you it will simplify and clarify your conversations with your stakeholders. So we're now going to create a measurement map. It's a visual depiction of your hypothesis, and we know that visuals help enable discussion, particularly on complicated things. And what's great about it, when you finish the map, is it tells you what data and systems that are required to do the study. So we know that visuals help. They help see things that you can't see with words and numbers. And so that's really what a measurement map is. So we're going to build one. I've got my investment on the left and all the way to my strategic goals on the right. The investment I'm going to look at today is around strategic selling. And I'm going to try to train my salespeople to increase their product mix to improve our company's margins. I'm also going to teach them ways to increase their quota attainment, to increase our revenue. And I'm hoping through that we can increase our salespeople retention, which will increase our productivity. Now I'm trying to link that investment with my corporate goals of improved financial performance. So that hopefully would be increased revenue and reduce costs. So if this program was successful, I would expect my salespeople would have more sales calls. Thus, they would have more proposals that they would write. And then my sales pipeline, I would expect late stage, which is those opportunities that are close to closing, I would expect to have more of those, and I would expect to close more of those quicker. So I would have more sales calls, more proposals, and hopefully more late stage opportunities. If that happens, I would see both a quantity of my sales pipeline increase, and I would see the quality of my sales pipeline increase. And again, my sales training is supposed to be teaching my salespeople how to do that. If that happens, I would have higher quota attainment. Wow, if all of that happens, again, this is I'm building my hypothesis, I would see increased revenue, I would see increased commissions, I would see salesperson turnover decrease, and I would reduce costs because of that. So I've achieved my goals of investment in this program and improving the corporation's financial performance. So this is a way that you can visualize and talk through a hypothesis. Now, we used to use Post-it notes. Some people might call these mind maps. I don't really care what you did. We eventually built a software product that could do this for us. But however you do that, it's kind of this process of thinking about how your investment is moving with the cookie crumbs in the forest, which would be your leading indicators, to get to the right cottage, which would be your business results. So measurement map helps you kind of figure this out. The second phase in the business impact framework is data collection and organization. Now, I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this because there's significant amount of research materials, my course goes into it, etc., on how to organize data. But it's really, we've identified our data sources. We need to rethink about some things, and then we need to collect and organize that data. Now here I need to add a teammate that's a data analyst. And it's somebody that really likes to get into the weeds on, for example, Excel spreadsheets and find relationships in pivot tables. And we can talk about, maybe I don't have to build, would be hire that person. Maybe I can borrow that talent or buy it. So let's talk a little bit about how you get started with some of this talent. We know you need to start with an analyst, a business analyst, an analyst, human capital strategist, whatever you want to call that. We don't necessarily have to then hire a data analyst, statistician, and eventually a project manager to manage all this stuff. But we might, depending upon our commitment to build the people analytics department and our budgets over time. But we can get started by maybe going down the hall or calling our friends in marketing or research or finance, and maybe borrowing a data analyst for some time to have them do some work for you on a freelance kind of basis within the organization. So you could borrow that talent. And I've seen many companies go to either consultants or using their local university professor or graduate student. We hired some both high school and college paid interns to do a lot of this organization of data, cleaning data, building the pivot tables. So you don't necessarily have to invest in every resource and build it through full-time people. You can borrow and buy help to get started. But we know our data is not good in HR. It's messy. And it sometimes has soft elements which are hard to quantify. You could have John Smith, J.R. Smith, and J. Smith in same person in 3 different systems. Now, it may or may not be 3 different people, but we have that kind of dilemma with our systems. We know they've been cobbled together historically. HR has been last in line typically to get funding for HR systems. So it does make data extraction and organization difficult. But the point is, if you don't work with your data, it will never get better. So you have to go in and say, I know my data is not perfect. We're going to work with it. And over time, it's going to be at the point where we believe it's good. Now I want to go back and talk again about some of these considerations with data. As you're pulling the data and organizing it, have you really lined up your sponsor and then some of the political asks you have? Because some of this data may come from outside, not only HR, but outside the company. Have you re-evaluated the standard operating procedures for data handling, and who owns that? How hard or difficult is it going to be? That will absolutely affect your timelines. And then make sure you've got some data protocol for security encryption of that data. And this quote from another friend of mine, RJ Milner at McKesson, is really, again, talking about data and data organization and gathering. Don't let perfect be the enemy of good, meaning get started. Your data will never be perfect. You will always be pulling data that would be called participation data. So who's going to be receiving this intervention and or investment? And then who are the people that are like them that will not be receiving it? Maybe some group won't get it till August and the first group gets it in April. Maybe some group won't get it till next year. So we want to be looking at both participant, and I'll show you in a minute why that's important. You have to identify, you might have to go to get payroll data that's a third-party payroll service. So sometimes data is not easy to get. You're going to be pulling both quantitative data, numerical data, and qualitative data, survey data. And typically HR projects have a combination of both. And then you're going to be wanting to figure out what time frame should I be pulling this data from? What's the length of the study? And I'll talk a little bit about that in just a minute. So that quickly was about data. Now I want to spend a few minutes and talk about really what descriptive analytics not only is, but what it can do for you. So you've organized that data, and now we're going to analyze it with our team of our data analysts and our analysts. You're going to uncover relationship and investigate the demographics behind those relationships. Descriptive analytics has a slew of benefits. Number one, it allows your team to get familiar with the data they have, and the more they start working with data, the better they can make it. It also creates a process to find gaps in your data so that you can begin to work on the completeness of it. Now, if the gaps are in areas where the data isn't very important or it's not answering an important question, you don't invest in that. But if the gaps are in data where it's a critical question and it's important to gather that data, then you need to invest in starting to gather that data. So over time, you've completed that gap and you've got good data in a critical area. Descriptive analytics will always uncover trends that are hard to see. Now, you may feel them. That's the art of HR. You may think these things are going. What descriptive analytics can do is uncover those and give you some proof. And just about every organization we have worked for, there's always myths that just in the descriptive analytics area, without even getting into predictive, you can begin to debunk some of the myths that are within these organizations. And then many descriptive analytics are presented in dashboards, and the pulling together descriptive can give you quick updates. So it's an easy way without a lot of technical need to be looking at data in either real time or close to real time when you put it into dashboards. I want to remind you, it's dual or multi-metric data, so you're pulling data from multi places, you're filtering it by demographic value, and you're pulling it from multiple systems, both internal and external to HR and maybe external to the company. And so what it gives you, this is a specific study that was done, and this is looking at injury compensation claims, which is the purple. You can see how high they are going from left to right over time, and they start decreasing, and they start decreasing as our training penetration of this subject increases. So as we train more people, which is the the bars, our injury claims start going down. That's what we would hope. So we invested in training in hopes that we would be bringing down compensation claims. So in descriptive analytics, without getting into some real sophisticated math, we're able to see that it certainly looks like our training program is having a dramatic effect. That's the value, very simply, of what descriptive analytics can do. So when you start looking at demographics, there's at least 3 different categories. And I'm so creative, I created another one because I couldn't figure out what to call it. Individual demographics are exactly what you would think they are. This is just a partial list of demographics or data that you might data mine. There's also organizational demographics of a location or geographic or a business unit, or what would be the manager and employee ratio in some kind of intervention. And then this very creative other category. But there's a whole bunch of things here that really could be very interesting depending on the study that you're trying to do. The point of this is there's a zillion demographics that can be data mined. What you've got to do is figure out the pertinent ones you think depending on the study and the ones where you have data. You may or may not have data on critical job role or recruitment source, for example. So descriptive analytics is really mostly presented in dashboard types and reports scenarios. It's an opportunity because you're using a lot of different data to create charts and graphs that are very visual. So let me show you a case study on a descriptive analytics study. This was done at VF. This is one of our published case studies. This is done at VF. VF is one of the, I think, the largest apparel company in the world. They have something like 40 different brands, and they were deploying a new performance management process. How can it be measured to improve as we roll it out? Does compliance and quality contribute to improved performance? The descriptive findings showed us that overall compliance is up. That's good. There were better conversations around performance that were happening. That's also a good sign. But there weren't very many good quality plans. And so employees needed more training on how to create a quality plan. So VF adjusted the rollout and the training of the rollout based on that. Now, this is all not statistical data. This is really a lot of survey and interview data that came from this. So what we found was leading by example makes a difference. So if you have a compliant manager, you had many, many more compliant employees than if you did not have a compliant manager. So that told VF to focus their training not just on creating quality plans for the employees, but focus their training on the managers. Get the managers to buy into this program and comply, and their employees then will. And we found those that had good quality plans led to much higher employee manager engagement. So here's an example of when we found one group of people that were way behind for some reason on developing their plans. And so we could zero in on that department. VF could zero in and find out why this department wasn't complying nearly the rate to the rest of the organization. So here's an example of, with just using descriptive analytics, VF was able to measure a program and then adjust it based on these findings as they rolled it out to their populations. But I want to talk for a minute about correlation, because it does not equal causation. Your dashboards and benchmarks are generally correlated information. So you must be very careful around it, because correlation is a statistical measure that indicates really what things fluctuate together, variables fluctuate. We're not exactly sure why. So we have to be careful making business decisions just based on these correlations. So here's two sets of data that are very highly correlated. That is, the amount of drowning deaths per day is directly correlated to the quarts of ice cream consumed per day. And this is real data. So you have to conclude ice cream must cause drowning deaths. So to solve this problem, you would abolish all ice cream, which makes no sense. But statistically, this is a very highly correlated set of data. The reason is it's the sun. When the sun comes out, it gets warmer, more people go swimming, more people die. When the sun comes out, it gets warmer, more people eat ice cream. There's no relationship between ice cream and drowning deaths to each other. The relationship is the sun. So this is a crazy example, but it's a real world example of be careful with the data that you have in your dashboards. Here's another fun one by TylerVegan.com. I love this analysis, and this is, if you looked at just this data, these two lines are very tightly correlated, and that is the number of people that drowned by falling in a pool, and over the last 10 years, the films that Nicolas Cage appeared in. And again, it's just silly, but I'm making the point that you have to be careful with your use of data within correlations. And so we'll finish the next step with, I'll talk briefly about what is in predictive analytics. And it's really descriptive analytics, adding a business outcome metric and using statistics and adding statistics to the mix. And if you think about the man on the mountain that was climbing on the cliff, this is why it's the cliff, because you need the skill set of a data scientist and or statistician to really begin to do this work in moving from correlation to causation. The benefits, though, are tremendous. Not only can you isolate the investment so you can understand where it works and how it works, but you can calculate an accurate ROI. You'll understand where that investment's working and not working. And it gives you data versus opinion to support improvement. And as you do this work, you can make live deployment improvements. So you can measure as you go and improve as you go as you deploy some of these. So I'm not going to go into a lot of the math, but I want to give you two different sets of concepts around this work. This work is called a longitudinal study. So you're really trying to look at two sets of people. First group that gets that intervention, and then a like group that hasn't received that intervention yet. And that could be because of bandwidth of the intervention, or it could be budgets. And not everybody generally in HR gets the same investment on the same day. So one group gets, as we call participants, the intervention, and you can see back to control and test by the drug trial methodology days. So one group gets that intervention, that training program, that recognition rewards initiative, that health initiative, and one group doesn't. And what we're looking at, the change in performance over time from prior performance of those groups to post-performance, and we're trying to isolate the effect of that intervention. And then using the demographics, we're always trying to figure out what are contributing factors or what demographics are playing into this between these two groups. So it's a study over time, and you're looking at participants and non-participants' performance over time, and then factoring in all of the demographics. And then in the statistics area, there's three concepts that we always work with. We talk about the magnitude of the impact. How much did this investment move that needle? We're talking about how certain we are statistically that that investment moved that needle to this degree, and then what statistically influence on each demographic had on those metrics. So there's a complicated statistics about this, but it's really those three concepts that we work with in the math area. So let's talk about Chrysler case study, and I'll show you what a predictive study can look like. We studied the issue that they had trained consultants outsold untrained consultants by 35 units a year. How many can be attributed to training. Does it reduce turnover? And then how can they maximize the benefits of training? This is Chrysler Academy that deployed the training to the dealerships. So these are the trained sales consultants and untrained sales consultants at their 3,500, I believe it was, sales consultants. And because the dealers had to pay for the training was their business case, they could prove that the training did help sell more cars. When we isolated the training from all the other variables in the environment, we could find that the training contributed to almost 16 new vehicles per year. And the other 19 vehicles was because of advertising and financing and all the other stuff, but the training contributed to 16 vehicles. So the Academy could now build a business case for the investment of training. We also then found that fully trained sales consultants had a 98% retention rate versus 48% with no training. We could double the retention rates by getting them fully trained. Holy moly, that's really, really powerful. We found that live training was most effective in urban stores, so that Chrysler stopped sending live trainers out to the rural stores, which was really expensive. And then the Academy, because they were so confident in the training and the value, gave the dealers a dealer kind of a car thing. They gave them a money back guarantee on their training. So you could get into not only did the training have value, you could calculate that value, but then you could figure out where it was working and where it wasn't. Things like live training wasn't working in the rural environments. So now let's talk for 1 minute about how to communicate and implement this stuff for change. We want you to communicate the findings. Well, I learned the hard way to communicate the findings with recommendations. We thought sometimes in the early days we presented findings and it was so obvious and companies honestly didn't know what to do with it. And then we took that a step further and said at our final meetings, we tried to get agreement on an implementation of those findings and then how you reevaluate whether those findings followed what you expected. And then you probably won't be involved, but you hopefully the organization will implement those recommendations. And then you want to evaluate those again and adjust. So it's really a circular process of measure, deploy, measure, adjust, deploy, measure, adjust. Now we're generally talking about pretty complicated information, and there's a really fine line between simplicity and complication and understanding versus just communicating. And there's no right or wrong. You've got to find that balance depending on the sophistication of the audience and the sophistication of the study. So really you need to understand your audience, the context of who's going to be in the room and how you present it. I can't tell you how many times we've gone into a meeting expecting it was going to be a project report and a senior executive decided to drop in and see the report and we didn't have an executive summary ready. So understand your audience and the context of it and what kind of reporting they expect and what time frames. You have to balance the narrative and graphics. Early in the days, we did mostly narrative. We then kind of overcompensated with graphics, and now a balanced report would have a balance of both narrative and graphics. And then make sure that your words really matter. Speak the language of the business versus HR speak, and make sure it's fact-based versus opinion. So go back then and make sure you've answered the business question. What are the critical insights? And what are the critical recommendations? So I'm going to end with just a quick plug for the training course that I have created and have launched. And it's really the culmination of a dozen years of this work. And it's really intended to get you started. It's self-paced. There's a lot of lessons in bites. And those that sign up, you'll receive an email Those that sign up based on this webinar will receive a free 1-hour coaching session with me personally. So I want to thank you. And now we'll entertain a few questions for the remaining minutes that we have. Okay, I've got one. What's the hardest part about getting started? The hardest part of getting started is really getting started. It's really overcoming your fear of the uncertainty and of the unknown. And it's really the courage to start, knowing that you're going to make mistakes, knowing that you're going to have people question your work. But it's really, the hardest part's really the initiative to just get going. And hopefully, with the tools we gave you today and others, we can get you to overcome that fear. People are doing this work and they're doing it well, and they've overcome that. So get going. Are there any other questions here? Well, yeah, okay, so there's just a ton. Let's pick one. So any tips on establishing a partnership with a research-based university, right level of person, type of school to engage? I would be more interested in you establishing a partnership, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a research-based university, in my opinion, with having you help them do the work. So having somebody, for example, do the data analyst work if you don't have to do that, or become your statistician part-time on projects. I don't necessarily think, although research-based universities are doing some tremendous work, I don't think you have to partner with them. I know a lot of companies that have partnered with their local junior college and some of the initiatives they're doing and some of the professors there. So I've got mixed feelings about that, but I would start with assistant professors, graduate students, math departments, the head of a math department. Those kinds of areas will be the places where the students may reside. We advertised in the UNC student paper for interns and found incredibly talented kids that applied for those jobs. Thank you, Richard, for the compliment. What benchmarks are most worthy to show in the benchmarks? I can't. So what benchmarks are the most noteworthy to show in the data? I can't answer that. I can't answer that because it depends on the problem you're solving and/or the questions you're asking. So if you're looking into one area like training, for example, the outputs and the data you would be looking at, the benchmarks you would be looking at would be very different than if you were looking at something around performance management or diversity. So there's no one size fits all in this work, and you have to kind of navigate through it. So I can't really recommend any specifics that would be noteworthy, because it depends. It depends on the study. It depends on the problems you have. This is a tough. So Christina, you're asking me a very tough question off the top of my head, because I'm not sure I'm prepared for this. Do you have an HR-related example of correlation versus causation? Well, you will, if you request, you can request a deck, and just in this deck, the two case studies I showed are really the differences between correlation and causation. So in the VF case study, we were looking at quality of performance reviews. We were looking at quality of conversations. And those are correlated because we were gathering that data through interviews and surveys and then scoring their performance reviews. So there was a fair amount of subjectivity in that study. So that's why those results were correlated, and they could make improvements from them, but it was important that they remeasured the improvements to make sure that those correlations that we were assuming were correct, if that made sense. In the Chrysler case study, we actually got to an isolated impact where we knew that roughly 16 of those cars being sold were directly related to the training. It wasn't because of all the other stuff that I talked about, the other 19 cars. So that's an example of hard data that was statistically isolated, that we could get to an isolated business impact. So those are two examples in this deck. I hope that answered your question. I'm not sure if I did. I've got one other question, and then I think we will end. Oh, here's a really good question, I believe, if you're not tripping me up again. Our historical data is very messy. Leadership changes, reorgs, rapid growth. We feel that it may not be very good predictor of future turnover, employee movement, etc. What would you recommend in such a case? You're 100% right. With all of those factors you mentioned in this question, your historical data probably is not a very good predictor. So I'm not sure if, in fact, you're going to be able to accurately predict turnover based on that data versus being very rigorous about collecting your current data, your current hires, the process you went through that, your onboarding process, and the early performance of those employees to begin to get a better prediction going forward based on today's events. Now, I didn't answer your question the way you wanted me to, because again, with this work, there's no easy answer. And sometimes you can't answer questions without creating new data and taking the time to let time happen before you can then make those predictions. So in your situation, I'm not sure if you should even be wise on trying to predict future turnover until you can get a handle on what the current environment, let's say in the last 6 months and the next 6 months, really looks like before you can do those predictions. So I hope that was helpful. I really enjoyed the questions, and I thank you for your participation. This is Gene Pease. Thank you very much. It was an honor to speak to you today. Thank you.